My name is Dale Hutchinson, and I'm 73 years old. In all my years on this earth, I've seen war, buried friends, lost love, and rebuilt my life from nothing more than dust and determination. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what my own son would do to me in those godforsaken woods of Montana. If you think you know what betrayal feels like, I'm here to tell you that you don't. Not until your own flesh and blood looks you dead in the eye and leaves you to die. Not until the child you raised, fed, clothed, and loved beyond measure becomes the very instrument of your destruction. This story will test every belief you have about family, trust, and human nature. And if you've ever wondered just how far a father will go for revenge against his own son, well, you're about to find out. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't believe where this goes. Trust me on that. It was October 15th, 2019. I remember the date because it was supposed to be our last hunt together, father and son, one final trip before I got too old to trek through the wilderness. The irony isn't lost on me now. It really was our last hunt, just not in the way I'd planned. The morning started like any other hunting trip we'd taken over the past 30 years. I was up at 4:30, coffee brewing, gear laid out with military precision. Old habits die hard, and my time in Vietnam taught me that preparation saves lives. Little did I know how much I'd need that lesson before the sun set. Trevor, that's my son, rolled out of his sleeping bag around 5, groggy and complaining about the cold. At 38, he's still active like a teenager sometimes, but I figured that was just his way. He'd always been the baby of the family, spoiled by his mother until the day she died 10 years prior. Maybe I should have seen the warning signs then, but when you love someone, you make excuses for their behavior. You tell yourself they'll grow out of it. We were hunting on my land, 2,000 acres of pristine Montana wilderness that I'd bought with my savings from 3 decades of construction work. Every tree, every ridge, every stream on that property was sacred to me. I'd walked those trails with my father before he passed, and I'd planned to pass them down to Trevor someday. The deed was already drawn up. All he had to do was wait. But waiting, as I'd learned, wasn't something my son was good at. The morning air was crisp, that kind of cold that bites at your lungs and makes everything crystal clear. We were tracking a 12-point buck I'd been watching all season, a magnificent creature that would have made a trophy worthy of our family's legacy. Trevor carried his .308 Winchester, the same rifle I'd taught him to shoot when he was 12. I had my trusty .30-06, the gun that had never let me down in all our years hunting together. We moved through the forest in comfortable silence, or so I thought. Trevor seemed distracted, checking his phone every few minutes despite the terrible cell reception. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said he was expecting an important call. I didn't press him. I figured it was work-related. He'd been struggling with his contracting business for months, always complaining about cash flow and competition. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near Devil's Canyon, a deep ravine that carved through the heart of my property. The locals had named it that for good reason. The walls were steep and jagged, and more than one hunter had met his end in those depths. I'd always been careful around that area, teaching Trevor from a young age to respect the danger it posed. As we ate our sandwiches, Trevor seemed more agitated than usual. He kept glancing toward the canyon edge, then back at his phone. Finally, he stood up and walked to the rim, staring down into the abyss below. That's when everything changed. I was packing up our lunch when I heard footsteps behind me, fast, purposeful footsteps. I turned just in time to see Trevor rushing toward me, his eyes wild with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something colder. Something calculated. Before I could react, his hands slammed into my chest with surprising force. I stumbled backward, my boots sliding on the loose rocks near the canyon's edge. For a terrifying moment, I teetered on the brink, windmilling my arms as gravity tried to claim me. But I didn't fall. Not yet. Trevor stood there, breathing heavily, his face a mask I didn't recognize. This wasn't the son I'd raised, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to tie his shoes, to be a man. This was someone else entirely. That's when he spoke the words that still echo in my nightmares. Say hello to the lions, Dad. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and my son crumbled like the loose rock beneath my feet. But the real horror was just beginning. You see, there were no lions in Montana. Never had been. But Trevor knew something I didn't, something that would make his words the cruelest joke of all. And as I stood there on the edge of that canyon, staring into the face of my own child, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous predators don't prowl the wilderness. They sit at your dinner table. I want you to understand something about falling. When you're 73 years old and you're plummeting down a rocky cliff face, time doesn't slow down like they show in the movies. It speeds up. Your mind races through a lifetime of memories in seconds, and all you can think about is how you got to this moment. As I tumbled through the air, branches tearing at my jacket, rocks scraping against my skin, one thought dominated everything else. Why? The canyon was deeper than it looked from the top, maybe 60 feet to the bottom. I hit an outcropping about halfway down that probably saved my life, spinning me around and slowing my descent just enough. When I finally crashed into the rocky floor below, the impact drove every ounce of air from my lungs. The world went dark for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When consciousness returned, the sun had shifted. My right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood was seeping from a gash on my forehead. Every breath felt like knives in my ribs, and my left shoulder hung useless at my side. But I was alive. That's when I heard them. At first, I thought my ears were ringing from the fall. But as my head cleared, the sounds became distinct. Growls. Low, rumbling sounds that made my blood freeze despite the pain. I forced myself to turn my head, and that's when I saw them. Mountain lions. 3 of them, maybe 4. They were circling something deeper in the canyon, something I couldn't quite see from my position. But their presence explained Trevor's words perfectly. This wasn't just attempted murder, it was a calculated execution. My son had known about the lions all along. See, what most people don't realize is that mountain lions sometimes den in deep canyon systems like Devil's Canyon. Trevor must have scouted this area, must have found their lair, and decided it would be the perfect way to dispose of his old man. No body to find, no evidence of foul play. Just a tragic hunting accident where dear old Dad got too close to the canyon edge and fell to his death. The lions hadn't noticed me yet. They were too focused on whatever had their attention deeper in the shadows. But it was only a matter of time. I needed to move, needed to find a way out of this death trap, but every movement sent waves of agony through my broken body. I managed to drag myself behind a large boulder, trying to assess my situation. My rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the fall. My phone had been in my jacket pocket, but the screen was shattered beyond repair. I was trapped at the bottom of a canyon with broken bones, no weapons, and a pack of predators who would eventually catch my scent. But here's what Trevor didn't know about his old man: I'm a survivor. You don't make it through Vietnam, through the death of your wife, through decades of hard labor without learning how to endure. Pain was nothing new to me. Fear was an old friend. And I'd be damned if I was going to die in some canyon because my son decided he'd rather inherit my land than wait for nature to take its course. As I lay there bleeding, trying to formulate a plan, I started putting pieces together. Trevor's financial troubles had been worse than he'd let on. The phone calls, the distracted behavior, the way he'd been asking pointed questions about my will over the past few months. He'd been planning this for a while. But why the elaborate scheme? Why not just wait? I was already in my 70s, and it wasn't like I was in perfect health. Then it hit me, the development company that had been sniffing around my property for the past year, offering obscene amounts of money for my land. I turned them down flat, told them the property would never be developed as long as I drew breath. Trevor must have made some kind of deal with them. Probably promised them the land in exchange for an advance on the purchase price. Money he'd already spent, no doubt, leaving him in a position where he needed me dead to avoid bankruptcy or worse. The realization that my son had sold my legacy, had planned my murder for money, sent a rage through me that burned hotter than the pain in my broken bones. But rage, I'd learned long ago, was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not if I wanted to survive. I forced myself to think tactically. The canyon walls were too steep to climb in my condition, but there had to be another way out. Water carved this canyon over thousands of years, which meant there had to be a stream or drainage system that led somewhere. If I could find it, follow it, maybe I could get to lower ground where someone might find me. But first, I had to deal with the lions. As if sensing my thoughts, one of them raised its head and looked in my direction. We locked eyes across the canyon floor, and I saw my death reflected in those predatory stares. The big cat, easily 8 feet long and probably 150 pounds, took a step toward me, then another. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was just a boy. He'd been a trapper in these same mountains, back when they were truly wild. He'd said that mountain lions were ambush predators, that they preferred easy prey. Show them you're not easy prey, he'd said, and they might just look for dinner elsewhere. I found a loose rock about the size of a baseball and hurled it as hard as I could toward the approaching lion. It struck the animal in the shoulder, and the cat leaped backward with a hiss that echoed off the canyon walls. The other lions raised their heads, suddenly alert. For a moment, we all just stared at each other. Then, slowly, the big cat backed away. They weren't hungry enough to risk injury on prey that might fight back. At least not yet. But I knew my reprieve was temporary. As soon as darkness fell, their hunting instincts would override their caution. I had maybe 6 hours to find a way out of this canyon before I became their midnight snack. 6 hours to survive my son's betrayal and start planning my revenge. Darkness was coming fast, and with it my death. I could feel it approaching like a cold tide, and every instinct I had screamed at me to move. But moving with a broken leg, damaged ribs, and a dislocated shoulder is easier said than done when you're 73 and trapped at the bottom of a canyon with hungry predators. I want to pause here and tell you something important. If you've ever felt like giving up, like the odds were stacked too high against you, remember this moment. Remember that sometimes survival isn't about being strong or young or lucky. Sometimes it's about being too damn stubborn to die. Using the boulder as support, I managed to pull myself upright. The pain was indescribable, like someone was driving railroad spikes through my bones with every movement. But pain meant I was alive, and alive meant I still had a chance to make Trevor pay for what he'd done. The lions had retreated deeper into the shadows, but I could hear them moving around, their padded footsteps echoing off the canyon walls. They were waiting, patient as only apex predators can be. They knew I was injured, knew I couldn't run. Time was on their side. But they didn't know Dale Hutchinson. I started mapping the canyon walls with my eyes, looking for any possible route to higher ground. The walls were mostly vertical limestone, worn smooth by centuries of weather and water. But about 30 feet to my left, there was a section where rockfall had created a series of natural steps and handholds. It wasn't much, but it was something. The hardest part was getting there. Every step was agony, dragging my broken leg behind me while trying to keep my balance with only one good arm. Twice I nearly collapsed, black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. But I kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Trevor got away with murder. When I finally reached the rockfall area, I discovered my first piece of luck in what felt like hours. There was a small cave-like depression in the canyon wall, just big enough for a man to squeeze into. It wasn't high enough to be completely safe from the lions, but it would give me some protection while I planned my next move. As I dragged myself into that cramped space, something caught my eye. Bones. Old bones scattered across the cave floor. And among them, partially hidden under decades of debris, was something that made my heart jump. A rifle. An old lever-action Winchester, probably left there by some long-dead hunter who'd met his end in this same canyon. The stock was cracked and the metal was rusted, but when I worked the action, it still functioned. There were even 3 cartridges in the magazine, corroded and ancient, but potentially still viable. Finding that rifle changed everything. I wasn't just prey anymore. I was a predator with teeth. The lions seemed to sense the shift. As full darkness settled over the canyon, they became more aggressive, circling closer to my hiding spot. I could see their eyes reflecting what little starlight filtered down from above, yellow and hungry and patient. Around midnight, the big male made his move. He approached slowly, testing my defenses, probably smelling my blood and thinking easy meal. When he got within about 15 feet, I took my shot. The old rifle kicked like a mule and belched smoke and fire into the darkness. The bullet, miracle of miracles, actually fired, and I heard the distinctive thwack of lead hitting flesh. The lion roared in pain and fury, leaping backward into the shadows. I'd wounded him, but I didn't know how badly. The other lions scattered at the sound of the gunshot, their primal fear of human weapons overriding their hunting instincts. I had maybe 2 shots left, and I'd need to make them count. But something else had happened with that gunshot. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and carried up into the night air above. If anyone was within miles of this place, they'd have heard it. It was a signal flare made of gunpowder and desperation. I spent the rest of the night in that cave, fighting to stay conscious, listening to the lions prowl just outside my reach. Every sound they made reminded me of Trevor's betrayal, fed the growing fire of rage that was keeping me alive. By dawn, that rage had crystallized into something harder than the rocks around me. A plan for revenge. When the sun finally crested the canyon rim, I heard voices. Distant at first, then growing closer. Search and rescue, probably alerted by the gunshot. I fired one of my remaining rounds into the air, and within an hour, they had ropes down to me. The rescue team was amazed to find me alive. The EMT, a young woman named Sarah, kept shaking her head as she worked on my injuries. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said as they stabilized my leg, "you're one tough old bird. Most people your age wouldn't have survived a fall like that, let alone a night in the canyon with mountain lions." I had motivation, I told her, though I didn't elaborate. As they lifted me out of that hellhole on a stretcher, I got my first look at the canyon from above since the fall. Trevor was nowhere to be seen, of course. According to the search team, he'd reported me missing around sunset the previous day, claiming we'd gotten separated during the hunt, and he couldn't find me. The story was that he'd searched until dark, then hiked back to town to get help. A grieving son, worried sick about his missing father. The performance of a lifetime. But I knew better. And now I had something Trevor didn't know I possessed: time. Time to heal, time to plan, and time to discover just how deep his betrayal ran. The hospital stay would give me that time. 3 weeks of surgery and recovery, 3 weeks of people feeling sorry for the poor old man who'd had such a terrible accident. 3 weeks of letting Trevor think he'd gotten away with attempted murder. 3 weeks to plan the perfect revenge. Because you see, Trevor had made one crucial mistake. He'd failed to finish the job. And as any hunter will tell you, a wounded animal is the most dangerous animal of all. Hospital beds are terrible places for sleeping but excellent places for thinking. For 3 weeks, as my bones healed and my body slowly put itself back together, my mind was working overtime. Every visitor, every flower arrangement, every "get well soon" card was a reminder of the lie I was living. Trevor played his part perfectly. He came to see me every day, bringing magazines and homemade soup, sitting by my bedside with the concerned expression of a devoted son. He even hired a private investigator to look into the accident, claiming he wanted to understand exactly what had happened to his poor father. If you've ever had to sit there and smile at someone who tried to kill you, you know it's a special kind of torture. Every word of sympathy, every gentle pat on the shoulder, every "Thank God you're okay, Dad," was like a knife twisting in my gut. But I smiled and nodded and played the grateful father, because I knew something Trevor didn't. I knew he'd made mistakes. The first mistake came to light during a visit from Sheriff Coleman, a good man I'd known for 20 years. He came to take my statement about the fall, standard procedure for any serious accident on hunting land. "Dale," he said, settling into the chair beside my bed, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened out there. I know it's difficult, but we need to get the details while they're still fresh." I told him the official story, that Trevor and I had gotten separated, that I'd gotten too close to the canyon edge while tracking the buck, that I'd slipped on loose rock and fallen. Every word was carefully crafted to sound like a confused old man trying to make sense of a traumatic accident. But Sheriff Coleman was sharp. He'd been investigating accidents and crimes in these mountains for decades, and something about my story didn't sit right with him. "The thing is, Dale," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we found some interesting evidence at the scene. Your son said you two were hunting together when you got separated around noon. But the tracks we found show that both of you were together at the canyon rim around lunchtime. 2 sets of footprints, very close together." My heart started racing, but I kept my expression neutral. "Well, we did eat lunch near there. Maybe that's what you're seeing." "Maybe," Coleman said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "There's also the matter of your rifle. We never found it at the bottom of the canyon. That's unusual for a fall like yours. Usually, everything goes down together." I hadn't thought about that. In all my planning during those long hospital nights, I'd forgotten that my rifle should have been found with me. Either Trevor had taken it after pushing me, or it had landed somewhere else during the fall. Either way, it was another inconsistency in his story. "I honestly don't remember what happened to it," I said, which was mostly true. "Everything after the fall is pretty hazy." Coleman nodded and made some notes. "We'll keep looking. Property that size, it could be anywhere." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Dale, you know I've known you and your family for a long time. If there's anything else about that day, anything at all that you remember, you call me." There was something in his tone that told me he suspected more than he was letting on. And that gave me an idea. After Coleman left, I started making phone calls. Not to friends or family, but to people Trevor didn't know I knew. You see, when you live in a small mountain community for as long as I have, you develop a network of contacts, people who see things, hear things, remember things. The first call was to Martha Hendricks, who worked at the land records office in town. Martha had been my wife's best friend, and she'd always been fond of me. More importantly, she had access to every land transaction in the county. "Dale, honey, I'm so glad you're okay," she said when I reached her. "The whole town's been talking about your accident. Trevor's been beside himself with worry." "I'm sure he has," I said carefully. "Martha, I need a favor. It's probably nothing, but could you check if there have been any recent inquiries about my property? Anyone looking into ownership records, tax assessments, that sort of thing?" There was a pause. "Well, now that you mention it, there have been some inquiries. That development company from Billings, Mountain Vista Holdings, they've been very interested in your land. They've pulled the records several times over the past 6 months. Anyone else?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dale, are you sure you want to know this?" My blood went cold. "Yes. Trevor was in here about 2 months ago. He wanted to know about the transfer process for inherited property, specifically how quickly a will could be probated if something happened to you." There it was. Confirmation that Trevor had been planning this for months. He'd done his homework, mapped out the timeline from my death to his ownership of the property. Probably already had a sale agreement with Mountain Vista Holdings, pending acquisition of the land. But Martha wasn't done. "There's something else, Dale. Trevor applied for a loan against the property about 3 months ago. A big loan, almost $500,000. He used projections of the property's value as collateral, claiming he had an agreement in principle to purchase it from your estate. The pieces were falling into place. Trevor hadn't just been planning to inherit my land, he'd already borrowed against it. Which meant he was in deep financial trouble and needed me dead to avoid defaulting on the loan. My second call was to Bobby Garrett, who ran the gun shop in town. Bobby had known Trevor since he was a kid and had sold him most of his hunting equipment over the years. "Bobby, I need to ask you about something," I said after the usual pleasantries. "Did Trevor buy anything from you recently? Any new equipment or ammunition?" "Funny you should ask," Bobby said. "He was in about a week before your hunting trip. Bought a box of .308 rounds and asked some strange questions about ballistics. Specifically, he wanted to know about trajectory at extreme range and whether a shot from, say, The top of a canyon could look like an accidental discharge. My blood turned to ice water. What did you tell him? I told him that was a hell of a specific question and asked if he was planning something he shouldn't be. He laughed it off, said he was just curious about hunting safety. But Dale. Bobby's voice dropped. I've been thinking about that conversation ever since your accident. It's been eating at me. Trevor hadn't just planned to push me into the canyon. He'd had a backup plan, to shoot me if the fall didn't kill me, then claim it was an accidental discharge while he was trying to rescue me. The perfect cover story. But he talked too much, asked too many questions, left too many breadcrumbs. And now I had enough evidence to start building a case. My third call was the most important. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 15 years, to a man I'd hoped never to need again. Hutchinson. The gravelly voice answered. I figured I'd hear from you eventually. Jack Reeves had been my commanding officer in Vietnam, and he'd gone on to have a very successful career in what he politely called security consulting. What he really did was solve problems for people who couldn't go to the police. Problems like mine. Jack, I need your help. And I need it off the books. When don't you? What's the situation? I told him everything. The fall, the lions, Trevor's financial problems, the loan against my property. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jesus Christ, Dale. Your own son? My own son. And you want me to what, exactly? I want you to investigate him. Everything, finances, communications, associates. I want to know exactly how deep this goes and who else is involved. And Jack? I want options. Another pause. Options for what? For making sure he pays for what he did. Dale, you know I don't do that kind of work anymore. I'm not talking about killing him, Jack. I'm talking about justice. The kind the courts can't provide. There was a long silence, then a sigh. I'll make some calls. Give me a week. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the fall. Hope. Not hope for reconciliation or forgiveness, but hope for revenge. Cold, calculated, devastating revenge. Trevor thought he'd gotten away with attempted murder. He thought his old man was too broken, too trusting, too weak to figure out what had really happened in that canyon. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Jack Reeves called me back exactly 1 week later, at 3 a.m. That's how I knew whatever he'd found was bad. Jack only called at ungodly hours when the news was going to ruin your sleep anyway. Dale, we need to meet, he said without preamble. Not over the phone, and not anywhere Trevor might see us. 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital, I drove my truck to an abandoned mining road about 20 miles from town. Jack was already there, sitting in a black Ford that looked like every other government vehicle ever made. At 75, he still carried himself like the Special Forces operator he'd been 50 years ago, straight-backed, alert, dangerous. You look like hell, he said as I climbed into his passenger seat. Feel worse. What did you find? Jack opened a thick manila folder and spread its contents across the dashboard. Bank records, phone logs, emails, photographs, enough evidence to bury Trevor 10 times over. Your son's in deeper than you thought, Jack began. The loan from Mountain Vista Holdings was just the tip of the iceberg. He's got debts with at least 3 different creditors, including some very unpleasant people from Vegas who don't normally accept late payments. He handed me a bank statement. Trevor borrowed $600,000 against your property 8 months ago. Not from a bank, from private lenders who charge interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. He was supposed to pay it back within a year, with the property sale as collateral. I studied the numbers, feeling sick. How much does he owe now? With interest and penalties? Nearly $1 million. And Dale, these aren't the kind of people who wait for probate courts. They want their money, and they want it now. The next document made my blood boil. It was a purchase agreement between Trevor Hutchinson and Mountain Vista Holdings, dated 6 months ago. He'd already sold my property, my life's work, for $1.8 million. The sale was contingent on clear title transfer, which in plain English meant my death. He's been living off the down payment, Jack continued. Bought himself a new truck, took a vacation to Hawaii, even put a down payment on a condo in Billings. He was spending your inheritance before you were cold in the ground. But the worst was yet to come. Jack pulled out a series of photographs, surveillance shots of Trevor meeting with two men in expensive suits. Mountain Vista executives, probably discussing the timeline for the property development. This gets worse, Dale. Mountain Vista isn't just some local development company. They're front for a corporation based out of Denver that specializes in what they call expedited acquisition of rural properties. They've done this before, targeted elderly landowners, convinced family members to help facilitate sales through creative means. I stared at the photos, trying to process what Jack was telling me. You're saying they've done this to other families? At least 4 other cases in Colorado and Wyoming over the past 5 years. Suspicious accidents, sudden illnesses, family disputes that ended with property changing hands quickly. Nothing that could be proven in court, but the pattern is clear. The final piece of evidence was a series of text messages between Trevor and someone listed only as VM in his phone. Jack had managed to obtain them through contacts I didn't want to know about. The messages painted a picture of a conspiracy that went far beyond a son's greed. Mountain Vista had specifically targeted my property because of its location. It sat on top of what geological surveys suggested might be a significant natural gas deposit. The development was just a cover story. The real money was in the mineral rights. One message in particular made my hands shake with rage. Old man's tougher than expected. Survived the fall. May need to expedite alternate plan. The response? Understood. Make it look natural. Heart attack, stroke, medication error. We have contacts at the hospital if needed. They'd been planning to kill me in the hospital if the canyon hadn't finished the job. Jack, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you have a plan. I have several. The question is how far you're willing to go. For the next hour, Jack laid out 3 different approaches. Option 1 was going to the authorities with everything we'd found. It was the safest route, but also the least satisfying. Trevor would probably get convicted of attempted murder, but the Mountain Vista executives would likely escape with minimal consequences. Corporate lawyers are very good at creating plausible deniability. Option 2 was public exposure. Leak everything to the media, destroy Trevor's reputation, and hope the negative publicity would be enough to bring down Mountain Vista's rural acquisition program. It would ruin Trevor's life, but it wouldn't necessarily put him behind bars. Option 3 was what Jack called poetic justice. We give Trevor exactly what he tried to give you, Jack explained. We put him in a position where he experiences the same fear, the same desperation, the same certainty of death that you felt in that canyon. But unlike him, we give him a choice at the end. I thought about that canyon, about the lions circling in the darkness, about the certainty that my son had condemned me to a horrible death for money. I thought about the text messages planning my murder in a hospital bed. I thought about the other families who'd been torn apart by this conspiracy. Option 3, I said without hesitation. Jack nodded like he'd expected that answer. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. This kind of operation takes months to plan and execute properly. Are you prepared to be patient? I looked out at the mountains in the distance, the same mountains where I'd nearly died because of my son's greed. Jack, I've got more patience than you can imagine. And all the time in the world. Over the next 2 hours, Jack outlined his plan. It was elaborate, risky, and absolutely brilliant. It would require Trevor to believe he was getting away with attempted murder while we maneuvered him into an increasingly desperate situation. We would use his own greed against him, turn his co-conspirators into enemies, and ultimately give him a taste of the terror he tried to inflict on me. The beauty of the plan was that Trevor would orchestrate his own downfall. Every move he made to try to salvage his situation would only make things worse. And at the end, when he was trapped and helpless and facing the same kind of death he'd planned for me, we'd give him the choice I never had. Confess everything and face the consequences, or take his chances with the wilderness. "There's one thing you need to understand," Jack said as we prepared to part ways. "Once we start this, there's no going back. If Trevor figures out what we're doing, if he goes to the police first, if any part of this goes sideways, you could end up in prison for the rest of your life." I thought about that for all of 3 seconds. Jack, I died in that canyon. Everything since then has been borrowed time. If I spend it making sure my son pays for what he did, I can live with whatever consequences come. And if he doesn't make the right choice at the end? If he chooses to take his chances rather than confess? I met Jack's eyes, and I think he saw something there that reminded him of the young soldier he'd commanded in Vietnam. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you make yourself. Then he'll get exactly what he tried to give me. And maybe those other families will sleep better knowing their loved ones were avenged. Jack smiled, not a pleasant expression on his weathered face. "Dale, I think this is going to be fun." As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness, exactly, but a sense of purpose. Trevor thought he'd won, thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. Mountain Vista thought they'd found another easy mark in a family torn apart by greed. They were all about to learn that some old men don't go gentle into that good night. Some of us bite back. If you've ever planned a military operation, you know that the most important phase happens long before the first shot is fired. You gather intelligence, position your assets, and most importantly, you convince your enemy that they're winning right up until the moment they realize they've already lost. Trevor made it easy. Greed is a powerful motivator, but it also makes people predictable. And predictable people are easy to manipulate. The first phase of Jack's plan was what he called reinforcement. We needed Trevor to believe that his story was holding up, that the authorities were satisfied with the accident explanation, and most importantly, that I suspected nothing. I played my part perfectly. When I got home from the hospital, I was the grateful father, constantly thanking Trevor for all his help during my recovery. I even asked him to help me update my will, claiming that my brush with death had made me realize how important it was to have everything in order. "Dad, you don't need to worry about that stuff right now," Trevor said, but I could see the hunger in his eyes. "Focus on getting better." "No, son, it's important. I want to make sure you're taken care of if something happens to me. This accident made me realize how quickly things can change." I had him drive me to my lawyer's office, where I made a big show of updating my will to leave everything to Trevor. What he didn't know was that Jack had helped me set up a series of legal traps in that document, clauses that would void the inheritance if certain conditions weren't met, conditions that would become relevant later. While I was playing the role of the trusting father, Jack was working behind the scenes to apply pressure to Trevor's co-conspirators. It started subtly: delayed payments from Mountain Vista Holdings, questions from their corporate lawyers about the timeline for property acquisition, hints that their geological surveys might have been overly optimistic about the natural gas deposits. The beauty of corporate conspiracies is that they're built on mutual distrust. Everyone involved is looking out for their own interests, and the moment things start going wrong, they turn on each other faster than wolves on a wounded deer. 3 weeks after I got home from the hospital, Trevor started showing signs of stress. He was getting phone calls at all hours, heated conversations he thought I couldn't hear from my bedroom. His Vegas creditors were getting impatient, and Mountain Vista was making excuses about delays in their development timeline. That's when Jack implemented Phase 2. Acceleration. The key was to make Trevor's financial situation desperate enough that he'd be willing to take bigger risks. Jack had contacts in the banking industry, people who owed him favors from his government days. With their help, we started calling in Trevor's debts. First, his truck loan went into default due to a computer error that marked his last 3 payments as never received. Then his credit cards were suddenly flagged for suspicious activity and frozen pending investigation. His business accounts were audited by the IRS, a process that tied up his assets for weeks while they verified every transaction. Within a month, Trevor went from feeling like he was about to inherit a fortune to facing financial ruin. And desperate people make desperate choices. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. I was in my den, supposedly reading a book but actually monitoring Trevor's phone calls through equipment Jack had provided. He was on the phone with someone from Mountain Vista, and his voice was getting louder and more agitated. "You don't understand," Trevor was saying. "I've got people breathing down my neck who don't take no for an answer. If I don't come up with the money soon, I'm a dead man." The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Mr. Hutchinson, we appreciate your situation, but our timeline hasn't changed. We need clear title to the property before we can finalize the purchase." "Then maybe we need to accelerate the timeline," Trevor said. There was a pause. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that old men in their 70s have heart attacks all the time. Especially old men who've been through traumatic experiences like Canyon Falls. The stress alone could trigger a cardiac event." My blood went cold as I listened to my son casually discussing my murder. "Mr. Hutchinson, I hope you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just observing that nature has a way of taking its course, and sometimes nature needs a little help." That conversation was recorded on equipment that would hold up in any court in the country. But more importantly, it confirmed what Jack and I had suspected. Trevor wasn't going to wait for natural causes. He was planning to finish what he'd started in that canyon. Which meant it was time for Phase 3. Revelation. The next morning, I called Trevor into my den and told him I'd been doing some thinking about the property. I said that maybe it was time to consider the offers from Mountain Vista Holdings, that I was getting too old to manage such a large tract of land. Trevor tried to hide his excitement, but I could see the dollar signs in his eyes. "Are you sure, Dad? I thought you wanted to keep the land in the family." "Well, I've been thinking about what you said about development bringing jobs to the area. Maybe it's time for progress." We spent the morning going over the details of Mountain Vista's proposal. I let Trevor think he was convincing me, when in reality, I was gathering information about the scope of their plans. The development was even bigger than I'd imagined. They wanted to turn my pristine wilderness into a resort complex with hundreds of cabins, golf courses, and commercial facilities. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was learning that they'd already started preliminary work on the property. Surveyors had been on my land for months, mapping out the development areas and identifying the most valuable mineral deposits. Trevor had given them access, probably with keys I didn't even know he made copies of. They'd been treating my property like it was already theirs, dividing up my legacy like vultures picking at a carcass. That afternoon, I told Trevor I wanted to see the property one more time before making a final decision. "I know it sounds sentimental," I said, "but I'd like to take one last walk through those woods, maybe visit the spot where I had my accident." Trevor's face went pale. "Dad, are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, going back there might be traumatic." "I need to do this, son. For closure." He tried to talk me out of it, suggested we just drive around the perimeter road instead. But I insisted, and finally, he agreed to take me out there the next day. That night, I called Jack with the final details of our plan. "He's more desperate than we thought," I told him. "And he's definitely planning something. Tomorrow might be his last chance before his creditors come calling. Are you ready for this, Dale? Once we're out there, everything has to go exactly according to plan." I thought about all the evidence we'd gathered, all the proof of Trevor's betrayal, all the other families who'd been destroyed by Mountain Vista's greed. I thought about those lions in the canyon, and how close I'd come to being their dinner because my own son valued money more than my life. "I'm ready, Jack. More than ready. Remember, the goal is confession, not revenge. We want him to admit what he did and implicate his co-conspirators. Justice through the legal system. And if he doesn't confess?" There was a pause. "Then we implement the contingency plan. And Trevor gets to experience exactly what he put you through." As I hung up the phone, I realized that tomorrow would determine not just Trevor's fate, but mine as well. Either I'd get the justice I deserved, or I'd become the kind of man who could watch his own son face the same terror he tried to inflict on me. Either way, the boy who'd pushed his father into a canyon full of lions was about to learn that some lessons come with claws and teeth attached. And if you think you know how this story ends, you're about to discover that revenge, like justice, sometimes comes in forms you never expect. The morning of reckoning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through your jacket and settles in your bones. As Trevor and I drove toward the canyon, I could feel his tension radiating off him like heat from a forge. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept checking his phone every few minutes, probably hoping for some last-minute reprieve from his creditors. What he didn't know was that Jack and his team were already in position. 3 former Special Forces operators, all friends of Jack's who specialized in what they politely called wilderness consulting. They'd been on my property since before dawn, setting up surveillance equipment and positioning themselves at strategic points around the canyon. More importantly, they'd spent the previous week making some modifications to Devil's Canyon that Trevor would soon discover. "You sure about this, Dad?" Trevor asked as we parked near the trailhead. "We could just sign the papers for Mountain Vista and be done with it. You don't need to put yourself through this." I could hear the barely concealed impatience in his voice. He wanted this over with, wanted me dead and buried so he could collect his blood money and pay off his debts. But he was trying to play the concerned son right up until the end. "I'm sure," I told him, shouldering the small backpack I'd prepared. "Sometimes you have to face your demons head-on." We hiked through the familiar woods, following the same trail we'd taken on that terrible day 2 months ago. Everything looked the same, the towering pines, the rocky outcroppings, the carpet of fallen leaves underfoot. But I knew that beneath the surface, everything had changed. I'd changed most of all. When we reached the rim of Devil's Canyon, I stopped and stared down into the depths where I'd nearly died. The morning light didn't penetrate very far into the shadows below, and I could almost see the lions prowling in the darkness, waiting for their next meal. "This is where it happened," I said quietly. "This is where I fell." Trevor moved up beside me, and I could feel his eyes studying my face, probably trying to gauge my mental state. Was I traumatized enough to be easily manipulated? Was I weak enough to be pushed again? "Dad, maybe we should. You know what I remembered while I was lying in that hospital bed?" I interrupted, turning to look directly at him. "I remembered that you knew about the lions." Trevor's face went carefully blank, the expression he perfected over years of lying to me. "What do you mean?" "The way you said say hello to the lions before you pushed me. Nobody talks about lions in Montana, son. Unless they know something specific." For just a moment, I saw panic flicker in his eyes. Then his mask slipped back into place. "Dad, I think the accident affected you more than we realized. Maybe we should get you back to the doctor." That's when Jack stepped out of the tree line behind Trevor, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Trevor spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol I knew he carried in his jacket. "I wouldn't," Jack said quietly. "You're surrounded." As if summoned by his words, 2 more men emerged from concealment, one from behind a large boulder, another from a cluster of pine trees. All 3 were dressed in hunting camouflage and carried rifles, but they moved with the precision of military operators. Trevor's eyes darted between them, calculating odds, looking for escape routes. But there weren't any. We'd chosen this spot carefully, with clear fields of fire in every direction and the canyon at our backs. "What is this?" Trevor demanded, but his voice cracked slightly. The confident facade was starting to crumble. "This," I said, "is justice. The kind your mother would have understood, even if she'd been heartbroken to see it necessary." I pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Trevor's voice filled the morning air, crystal clear and unmistakably his own. "I'm suggesting that old men in their 70s have heart attacks all the time. Especially old men who've been through traumatic experiences like Canyon Falls." The color drained from Trevor's face as he heard his own words condemning him. "We have everything, son. Bank records showing the money you borrowed against my property. Text messages between you and Mountain Vista discussing my death. Witness testimony about your questions regarding ballistics and hunting accidents. And now we have your confession about planning to murder me." Trevor looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. "You can't prove anything." Those recordings could be fake, taken out of context. No jury would. You're right, I said. A jury might not convict you. Corporate lawyers are very good at creating reasonable doubt. Which is why we're not going to trial. Jack stepped forward and handed Trevor a manila envelope. Open it. With shaking hands, Trevor pulled out a series of photographs and documents. His face went from pale to gray as he realized what he was looking at. The photos showed him meeting with Mountain Vista executives, accepting envelopes of cash, signing documents. The papers included copies of all his financial records, loan agreements, and communications with his creditors. Everything that proved his motive for attempted murder. These copies are being delivered to the FBI, the IRS, and the Montana State Police as we speak, Jack said. Along with evidence of Mountain Vista's pattern of targeting elderly landowners for expedited acquisition. You and your corporate friends are going to have a lot of explaining to do. But that wasn't the end of it. Jack handed Trevor a second envelope, this one thicker. That contains copies of everything we're sending to the Las Vegas Police Department regarding your gambling debts and the people you owe money to. Turns out some of your creditors have outstanding warrants and very bad reputations for collecting debts. The FBI is very interested in talking to them about their business practices. Trevor opened the envelope with trembling fingers, and I watched his face crumble as he realized the full scope of what we'd done. We hadn't just exposed his attempt on my life. We'd destroyed his entire network of criminal associates. You bastard, he whispered, looking at me with pure hatred. You evil old bastard. I'm evil? I asked quietly. I'm not the one who pushed his father into a canyon full of lions. I'm not the one who planned to murder him in a hospital bed. I'm not the one who sold his inheritance to pay gambling debts. That's when the real revelation came. Jack handed Trevor one final document, a deed showing that Mountain Vista Holdings had been dissolved 3 days earlier. The company was gone, their assets frozen, their executives under federal investigation for fraud. The land sale you've been counting on? Jack said. It doesn't exist anymore. The down payment you've been living on? The FBI seized those accounts yesterday as part of the investigation. You have no money, no buyers, and about 72 hours before your Las Vegas friends come looking for what you owe them. Trevor staggered backward, his face a mask of desperation and disbelief. This isn't possible. You can't just destroy someone's life like this. You destroyed your own life, I said. I just made sure everyone could see the wreckage clearly. For a long moment, we all stood there in silence, the wind whistling through the pines and carrying the sound of approaching sirens. Sheriff Coleman and the FBI would be here soon to arrest Trevor and begin the long process of unraveling Mountain Vista's conspiracy. But first, I had one final gift for my son. Trevor, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a father who'd reached the end of his patience. You have a choice to make. You can confess everything, your attempt to murder me, your conspiracy with Mountain Vista, the names of everyone involved. If you do that, if you make a full confession and cooperate with the authorities, I'll make sure you get protective custody while you're in prison. Your gambling creditors won't be able to reach you. Trevor looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion. And if I don't? I gestured toward the canyon behind us. Then we leave you here, just like you left me. No weapons, no phone, no way out except down. Maybe you'll survive the fall like I did. Maybe you won't. But either way, you'll have exactly the same chance you gave me. The sirens were getting closer. In a few minutes, this would all be out of my hands, turned over to lawyers and judges and the slow machinery of justice. But right now, in this moment, Trevor's fate was entirely up to him. Choose, I said. Confession in prison, or take your chances with the canyon. Trevor looked down into the depths of Devil's Canyon, then back at me. And in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. Fear. Real, honest, soul-deep terror. The same fear I'd felt when he'd pushed me toward those waiting lions. Trevor stood at the edge of Devil's Canyon for what felt like an eternity, staring down into the abyss that had nearly claimed my life. The sirens were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes out, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. 38 years of entitlement and selfishness battling against the primitive fear of death. "This is insane," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're my father. You can't actually be serious about this." "I was your father when you pushed me into this canyon," I replied. "I was your father when you planned to murder me in my hospital bed. That didn't stop you from trying to feed me to the lions." Jack and his men maintained their positions, rifles ready but not threatening. They were professionals, and they understood that this moment belonged to Trevor and me. Whatever choice he made would define not just his future, but mine as well. "The confession," Trevor said suddenly. "What exactly would I have to admit to?" I pulled out a prepared statement that Jack's legal contacts had drafted. "Everything. The attempted murder, the conspiracy with Mountain Vista, the fraud, the money laundering. Names, dates, amounts. Full cooperation with federal investigators." Trevor read through the document, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pages. "This would put me away for 20 years. At least," I confirmed. "But you'd be alive. In protective custody, safe from your Vegas creditors, with the possibility of parole if you cooperate fully." He looked back at the canyon, then at the approaching dust cloud that marked Sheriff Coleman's convoy. "And if I choose the canyon? Then we leave you here with the same equipment you left me, nothing. No food, no water, no weapons, no communication device. Just you and whatever survival skills you think you have. The lions are still down there. Jack's team confirmed it yesterday. A female with 2 cubs, probably the same family that almost killed me. They'd been feeding on deer carcasses we left for them, so they're well fed right now. But hungry lions are patient hunters." Trevor's face went gray. He was beginning to understand the full implications of his choice. It wasn't just about falling into the canyon, it was about surviving everything that came after. "You said you survived?" he said desperately. "You found a way out." "I had military training, 40 years of wilderness experience, and pure stubborn determination to stay alive long enough to see you pay for what you did." "What do you have, Trevor?" The sirens were very close now. I could see the first police cruiser cresting the hill about a mile away, followed by several unmarked federal vehicles. "Decide," I said. "Right now. Confession or canyon?" That's when Trevor surprised me. Instead of making a choice, he pulled out his phone and speed-dialed a number. He was calling someone, probably trying to arrange some last-minute deal or escape plan. But nothing happened. No signal, no connection. "Jack had the cell tower shut down about an hour ago," I explained. "Federal emergency protocol. Nobody's making any calls until this is over." Trevor stared at his dead phone, then threw it on the ground in frustration. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? I had 2 months in a hospital bed to plan this moment. 2 months of lying there, remembering what it felt like to be betrayed by my own son. Yes, I've thought of everything." The police convoy was close enough now that I could make out individual vehicles. Sheriff Coleman's cruiser in the lead, followed by FBI sedans and what looked like a SWAT transport. "They'd be here in less than 2 minutes. "Choose," I said again. "Last chance." Trevor looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger, not defiance, but something that might have been respect. Maybe even admiration for the trap I'd constructed around him. "You know what the really fucked up part is?" he said. "I actually admire what you've done here. The planning, the execution, the way you've systematically destroyed my entire life while making me complicit in my own destruction. It's brilliant, Dad. Absolutely brilliant. Is that your answer?" Trevor walked to the canyon's edge and looked down one more time. When he turned back to me, something had changed in his demeanor. The desperate, cornered animal was gone, replaced by something calmer but no less dangerous. "I'll confess," he said. "But not because I'm afraid of the canyon. I'll confess because I want to watch you live with what you've become." Before I could ask what he meant, Trevor started talking, and the words that came out of his mouth changed everything I thought I knew about that day in October. "You want to know the real truth about what happened in that canyon, Dad?" The whole truth? Yes, I pushed you. Yes, I planned it. But I didn't plan it alone. My blood went cold. What are you talking about? Mom knew, Trevor said, and his voice was steady now, matter of fact. Before she died, she knew about your affair with Martha Hendricks. She knew about the other women over the years. She knew what kind of man you really were. The world seemed to tilt around me. Martha Hendricks had been my wife's best friend, yes. But there had never been an affair. There had never been any other women. My marriage had been solid, built on 40 years of love and trust. That's a lie, I said. Is it? Check her diary sometime. Check the private investigator reports she commissioned. Check the bank records showing the private account she set up to hide money from you. Trevor smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on another human being. Mom spent the last 2 years of her life planning to divorce you and take half of everything you'd built. The only thing that stopped her was the cancer. The police vehicles were pulling into the parking area now, doors slamming, officers taking positions. But I couldn't focus on any of that. Trevor's words were hitting me like physical blows. Before she died, she made me promise to make sure you never got to enjoy the fruits of your lies and betrayals. She wanted the land sold, the money donated to charity, your legacy erased. But I was greedy, Dad. I decided to keep the money instead of donating it. I staggered backward, my legs suddenly weak. Sarah never said anything. Never accused me of anything. Of course not. She was too proud, too dignified to confront you directly. But she knew, Dad. She knew everything. Sheriff Coleman was approaching now, flanked by FBI agents, but they stayed back when Jack signaled that the situation was still in progress. So yes, Trevor continued, I'll confess to attempted murder. I'll confess to conspiracy and fraud and everything else. But I want everyone to know why I did it. I want them to know that I was trying to carry out my dying mother's wishes to make sure her cheating husband never got to enjoy the life he built on lies. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Even if Trevor was lying, and I had to believe he was lying, the seed of doubt was planted. Had my wife suspected something that wasn't true? Had she died believing I'd betrayed her? You're lying, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Am I? Ask Martha Hendricks. Ask her about the conversations she had with Mom in those final weeks. Ask her why Mom changed her will 3 times in the last year of her life. Trevor turned to Sheriff Coleman, who was now close enough to hear our conversation. Sheriff, I'm ready to make a full confession to the attempted murder of my father, Dale Hutchinson. But I want it on record that I was motivated by knowledge of his extramarital affairs and my dying mother's wishes for justice. As the handcuffs clicked around Trevor's wrists, he looked at me one last time. Enjoy your victory, Dad. But remember, I'm not the only one who knows the truth about what kind of man you really are. And prison sentences eventually end. They led him away, and I stood there at the edge of Devil's Canyon, feeling like I'd won the battle but lost something much more important. The revenge I'd planned so carefully suddenly tasted like ashes in my mouth. Because even if Trevor was lying, and I prayed to God he was lying, he'd accomplished something with his final words that all my elaborate planning hadn't anticipated. He'd made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my own life. 6 months have passed since that morning at Devil's Canyon, and I'm sitting in my den writing this story as snow falls outside my window. Trevor is in federal prison, serving a 25-year sentence after his full confession led to the dismantling of Mountain Vista Holdings and the arrest of 17 co-conspirators. The FBI called it one of the largest rural land fraud schemes in American history. Justice was served. I got my revenge. So why do I feel like I lost everything that mattered? The answer lies in a cardboard box I found hidden in my wife's sewing room 3 weeks after Trevor's arrest. Inside were documents that confirmed some of what he'd said, but not in the way I'd expected. Sarah hadn't hired a private investigator to follow me, she'd hired one to investigate Trevor. My wife had discovered her son's gambling debts, his connections to dangerous people, his increasingly desperate financial situation. The investigators' reports painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control, making increasingly bad decisions to try to dig himself out of debt. But there was more. Sarah had also discovered Trevor's initial contact with Mountain Vista Holdings. She'd known, months before her death, that her son was planning to sell the family land the moment I was gone. The bank account Trevor mentioned wasn't secret money hidden from me. It was a fund she'd been building to buy out Trevor's inheritance, to keep him from destroying everything we'd built together. She'd been trying to save our family legacy from our own son. The diary Trevor referenced existed, but it told a very different story than the one he'd implied. Page after page of a mother's anguish over her son's behavior, her fears about what he might do, her desperate attempts to find a way to protect both her husband and her child from the consequences of Trevor's choices. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, broke my heart. I know what T is planning. The land company man approached him again today. I saw them talking in the driveway. I'm afraid for Dale. Not afraid of Dale, but afraid for him. T has gotten himself into something terrible, and I don't know how to save them both. If something happens to me before I can fix this, I pray Dale will be strong enough to protect himself. I pray T will find his way back to being the son I raised him to be. But I'm afraid it may be too late for both of them. She'd known. My Sarah had known exactly what kind of danger I was in, and she died before she could warn me or stop it. Reading those words, I realized that Trevor's final manipulation hadn't been directed at me. It had been directed at his mother's memory. He tried to poison my last remembrance of her, to make me doubt the love that had sustained us for 40 years. In his twisted mind, if he had to lose everything, he was going to make sure I suffered too. But he'd failed. Sarah's own words, written in her careful handwriting, told the truth about our marriage, about her love for me, about her fears for our son. She'd never doubted my faithfulness, never questioned my love for her. She'd only doubted whether she could save Trevor from himself. And in the end, she couldn't. None of us could. I visited Trevor in prison once, about a month after his sentencing. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the institutional environment. When I sat down across from him in the visiting room, he smiled that same cold smile I'd seen at the canyon. "Come to gloat?" he asked. "I came to tell you about your mother's diary," I said. For just a moment, his mask slipped. "What diary?" I told him about the box, about the investigators' reports, about Sarah's real plans for the money he thought she'd been hiding from me. I told him about her final entry, about her fears for both of us, about her desperate attempts to find a way to save our family from his destructive choices. When I finished, Trevor was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me, and for a brief instant, I saw the little boy I'd raised, the child I'd loved unconditionally. "She was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "She was trying to protect both of us." Trevor nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Dad. For all of it. For what I did to you, for what I tried to do to her memory. I'm sorry." It was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since that day at the canyon. But sorry doesn't undo attempted murder. Sorry doesn't bring back the trust that was shattered when he pushed me toward those lions. Sorry doesn't erase the months of planning and manipulation that led to that moment. "I know you are," I told him. "But sorry isn't enough. That was the last time I saw my son. He's applied for parole twice since then, but I've testified against it both times. Not out of revenge. The time for revenge is past. But because I don't believe he's truly changed, and I don't believe he ever will. The land is still mine. I've had several offers from development companies over the past year, but I've turned them all down. Instead, I've donated the property to the State Park Service, with the stipulation that it remain wilderness forever. No development, no mineral extraction, no commercial activity of any kind. Just 2,000 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, preserved as a memorial to my wife's love and her faith in the enduring power of the natural world. I kept the house and about 10 acres around it. More than enough for an old man to live out his remaining years. I spend my days reading, working in the garden Sarah planted, and writing these words for people like you who might need to hear them. Because here's what I learned from all of this: revenge is a luxury that costs more than you can afford to pay. I got my justice, saw my son punished for his crimes, watched his co-conspirators face the consequences of their greed. But the price was the destruction of my family, the loss of the last person who shared my blood, the end of the Hutchinson name in these mountains. Was it worth it? I honestly don't know. Some nights, when I'm sitting alone in this house that once rang with laughter and love, I think maybe I should have just walked away. Sold the land, moved somewhere else, let Trevor deal with his own consequences without involving myself in elaborate schemes for revenge. But then I remember those lions in the canyon, remember the certainty that I was going to die alone, and afraid because my own son valued money more than my life. I remember the text messages planning my murder in a hospital bed, the casual cruelty of treating my death as a business transaction. And I remember the other families, the other elderly landowners who died under suspicious circumstances while companies like Mountain Vista Holdings acquired their properties through fraud and intimidation. Trevor's confession led to a federal investigation that prevented dozens of other tragedies, saved other families from experiencing what we went through. Maybe that's enough. Maybe preventing other sons from betraying their fathers, other companies from targeting vulnerable elderly people, maybe that justifies what I did. Or maybe I'm just an old man trying to convince himself that revenge and justice are the same thing. I'll let you decide. What I will tell you is this: if someone you love betrays you, if they try to destroy everything you've built and everyone you care about, don't spend years plotting elaborate revenge schemes. Don't sacrifice your soul on the altar of justice. Don't become the kind of person who can look their own child in the eye and offer them a choice between prison and death. Because in the end, the person revenge changes most is you. I'm 74 years old now, and I've got maybe 10 good years left on this earth. I plan to spend them tending Sarah's garden, walking the trails we hiked together, and remembering the love we shared before our son's greed poisoned everything we built. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the pines, I can still hear the sound of those lions in the canyon. And sometimes I wonder if Trevor was right about one thing: maybe we're not so different after all. Maybe we're both predators, just hunting different prey. But that's a thought for another sleepless night. If this story has taught you anything, let it be this: love the people in your life while you can. Trust them, but verify that trust. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly where you're vulnerable. Thanks for staying with me through this long, dark journey. If it helped you understand something about family, betrayal, or the price of revenge, then maybe telling it was worth something after all. And if you're ever in Montana, if you're ever hiking through Devil's Canyon State Park, listen carefully to the wind in the pines. Sometimes it carries the sound of old grudges and older regrets, the echoes of choices that can never be undone. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one, stories about the shadows that live in every family, the secrets that poison love, and the price we pay for the justice we think we deserve. Because everyone has a canyon in their life. And everyone has to decide whether they're going to push someone into it, or find a way to bridge it. Choose wisely.